All right, y'all. Continuing our conversation, monologue. Really, let's be honest. This isn't a conversation. It's me yakking at y'all, and even more than normal, which isn't it great. Anyway, I know this isn't the ideal way to handle these lectures. It's certainly not what I would hope to do in terms of teaching. I'm still trying to figure out maybe ways we can do WebEx meetings or something to at least have some level of interaction here. But, we'll figure that out as we go along. Hope everybody is doing okay. Today's lecture focuses on managing biodiversity. Don't have an activity for today's talk, so lucky you, but hopefully you'll at least listen to the lecture anyway. And again, it's probably stuff you've heard in other classes, so don't really need to spend a ton of time on it, so I'll try and go through this fairly efficiently. But talking about biodiversity, what are some benefits, right? I want y'all to think about that. Obviously, we'll talk about those in a second. Having a biodiverse ecosystem is a good thing in terms of resilience and so forth. We'll talk about and some challenges to biodiversity as well. So, definition of biodiversity is pretty simple. It's the variety and variability of life on Earth. Bio obviously means living, and so we're talking about plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, all of those things that make up the biotic component of our ecosystem and our biosphere. And there's different ways to measure biodiversity. So it actually scales from the individual level of genetics. So that means within a particular population of a particular species, there are genetic variabilities among those individuals. So obviously, if you look across people, even within your own household, right? Even though like your whole family is related, y'all are all genetically different, right? Male, female, other variations that happen, different hair color, different eye color, all of those are genetic variability within individuals of the same species, right? Then we pop up to species level, and so you actually have different kinds of organisms, again, within an ecosystem. So you have plants and animals and bacteria and fungi, and all of those different biotic components have different relationships. So we talked about food chains and food webs in the last lecture. So some things are eaten, some things eat other things. Some eat vegetables or plants, some eat other animals, right? All of those relationships make up species diversity within an ecosystem. And then up at the highest level, right, the ecological or ecosystem level, we have different habitats, different niches, different species interactions. So as we move up the scale, we move from individual differences to differences across species to differences across ecosystems as a whole. So within the picture here at the top, let me see if my mouse isn't working for me here. There we go. You've got the aquatic ecosystem of the river, you have the shoreline, you've got the forest, and you move up into the mountains. Those are all different ecosystems individually, but they also interrelate with one another. And so that's biodiversity across those ecosystems. So some of the benefits of biodiversity include food. 90% of today's foods have been domesticated from the wild. That obviously doesn't include Pop Tarts and Twinkies, though they are delicious and a staple of self quarantining and social distancing, I would expect for many of you and many of me. Actually, don't have any Twinkies, but I do have Pop Tarts. Anyways, sorry. Obviously, we get our food from nature and we've changed it over the years. So if you go back to like what corn or maize looked like 10,000 years ago when it was first domesticated, it was tiny and basically, nothing like the giant ears of sweet corn that we get today. So we've actually, over the 10,000 years since it was first domesticated, we have modified it significantly to get to, sweet corn that we find on our grocery store shelves today. Drugs and medicine, we talked about that in the last lecture as well. Much of our medicine comes from natural compounds that we then synthesize to mass produce into medicine. fuel, whether it be wood, coal, animal dung in many places. That's actually a primary fuel. They dry animal dung and use that as fuel, which puts a sweet flavor into your meats that you cook over it. And let me tell you, I have no idea. I've never eaten food cooked on dung, but I can't imagine you get a nice bark on it. Anyways, social value, we talked about that, right? The recreational value of open space and strong ecosystems. Also, plants, animals, and places are considered sacred. So that certainly influences how we think about ecosystems and our relationship to them. And when we have biodiversity, that contributes to resilience. So more species, more interactions, reduce opportunities for a single threat to destroy the entire system. Just like we talked about when we talked about economic development and the value of having a diverse economy in a community, and how when you have multiple different businesses and lots of different inputs for financial well-being, if one business fails for whatever reason, you're not losing your entire economic system. It's the same with the environment. When we have biodiversity, we have these diverse ecosystems, we have more resilience. They're able to withstand shocks and pressures more effectively and rebound from them more quickly. So hopefully starting to make those connections between environment, economics, social, all those things. Hopefully you're starting to connect in your head as we walk through all of these different things. So biodiversity hotspots are those areas that have been identified as critical habitats or critical biodiverse spots. And so you can kind of see the map of them across the globe here. They include coral reefs, estuaries and wetlands, tropical forests, right? These are all areas that are seen as major biodiversity hotspots, areas with particular species or particular sensitivities that are threatened by development, threatened by pollution, threatened by change, and climate change and so forth. And so you can kind of get an idea for some of those different areas across the globe. And obviously one of the threats to biodiversity is extinction. And extinction has happened throughout history. There have been, I think, 5 great extinction level events across history, right? The one we're probably the most familiar with is the dinosaurs, right? The end of the Cretaceous period, question mark. One of y'all can Google that and let me know actually in the comments. So, but again, when the dinosaurs got wiped out, that was a great extinction event, allowed for the rise of mammals to kind of take over the planet. But since humanity has risen to be the dominant species on the planet, now we're seeing extinctions caused by human activity, not just sort of natural processes. And so there's the claim now that we are entering what could be considered the 6th great extinction, and it's largely caused by human activity. So we are actually causing the extinction through pollution, through climate change, through loss of habitat, all of those impacts that humanity is having on the environment. We are actually pushing more and more species to extinction than ever before in history, and actually creating the same level of extinction that we saw at the end of the Cretaceous when the dinosaurs went extinct, and other great extinction events. So certainly a problem, certainly something we need to think about in terms of our impact on the environment. And some of the challenges that come from that is that because we get so much from nature, particularly in terms of like medicine and things like that, we don't know what we're losing when a species goes extinct that we haven't discovered yet, or that we don't know about, right? The cure for cancer, the cure for diabetes, the cure for coronavirus could be in a species that we are pushing into extinction, and we just haven't discovered it yet. So as we lose species, we're losing opportunity to better our own lives, and take advantage of that natural resource, because it's lost before we know it's a resource. So that's some of the issues when we think about extinction, and some of the challenges that we face, in addition to just the loss of biodiversity, the loss of these species that have value in their own right. And human activity, as mentioned, has an enormous impact on biodiversity. So urban development, obviously changes habitat, changes ecosystems, devours land faster than population is growing. So if you look at most of the cities in the United States, the population is growing at, X per year, but the amount of land that we're actually consuming is much greater than you would expect given the population growth. And that's largely because we like the suburban sprawl model, right? So we've talked a lot about that. That's sort of the conventional development pattern. Go out a little farther out, buy a chunk of land, build a bunch of houses on it. When that sells, go a little further out, buy a chunk of land, build a bunch of houses on it. So our patterns of development are increasing the urbanized footprint, impacting the larger environment, impacting ecosystems, impacting species diversity. All those things are being changed by our urban growth patterns. Additionally, the roads and other infrastructure that supports those sprawling development patterns interrupt habitat, disrupt migration patterns, all sorts of negative impacts as well that go along with just the land being consumed for housing. So, agriculture is also has an impact on the larger environment. So, most of our industrial agriculture is monocultures. We plant 1,000 acres of corn or 1,000 acres of soybeans or whatever it might be. We have these massive monoculture fields that don't provide habitat. I mean, for some species they might, but we don't have the diversity of habitat that's required to really maintain biodiversity. We're putting pesticides, fertilizers onto those lands, and so certainly we need industrial agriculture. We have 7 billion people on the planet. We need industrial agriculture to feed the world, and properly managed industrial agriculture is not, I mean, it's not the huge environmental negative that oftentimes it's portrayed as. So it can be done. Fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides can all be applied in an appropriate manner to where you don't get a ton of runoff. You're not having a significant impact on the outside environment, right? So, recognizing that we need to balance food production with maintaining healthy ecosystems and biodiversity is a challenge, but it can be done, and we're smart enough to do that. And most farmers, the overwhelming majority of farmers are practicing best, good habits, good practices to minimize their environmental impact as much as possible. So aquaculture is growing in popularity. So you're seeing more and more farmed fish. And so there are certainly some benefits to that in terms of production. And you're not depleting wild stocks by fishing them because you're producing, farmed catfish, farmed tilapia, farmed salmon, right? These species are being kind of mass produced in a way that helps to protect the wild stocks to some extent. But there are some challenges that go along with aquaculture. So you can have pollution, you can have like the food that gets fed to the pinned fish can contaminate natural food sources. You can get interbreeding from the farmed fish to the wild fish that can weaken the wild fish, right? There's some issues there. Disease spread and so forth that can impact natural stocks of fish as well. So again, done properly, it can be a great resource, particularly with species like catfish and tilapia. That can be a really sustainable model for fish production. Other species less so. Obviously, pollution is an enormous impact on biodiversity. So plastic pollution, we all probably have seen the video of the turtle with the straw up its nose. Even on the most remote beaches in the world, most remote parts of the world, you can find plastic trash. Microplastics are an enormous challenge. It's actually now becoming part of rainfall. The microplastics are going up with evaporation and falling as rain. So we're spreading plastic across the globe into every ecosystem, every environment, into the food we eat now because things are consuming these microplastics, which then we consume. And so we're getting plastics everywhere. Water pollution, pesticides, fertilizers, air pollution, all of these things are impacting the larger environment and ecosystems and biodiversity. So poor forest management is certainly a challenge as well. In some areas, we're actually seeing Um, Reforestation, particularly like in the northeast of the United States, areas that had been farmed in like the colonial period and early American history, as that soil depleted, farmers moved west. Population patterns have changed. We're seeing a lot of forest growth in areas that had been previously farmed, so that's certainly a positive. But we're seeing continued destruction of forests, like in the rainforest of South America, parts of Africa, other parts of the globe where we're seeing poor forest management actually changing habitats, decreasing biodiversity. Also, in parts of the United States here, we're cutting forests and replacing, these diverse forests with monoculture forests. So, the lumber companies will come in, take down what's there, plant, hundreds of the same species. So you're actually getting trees regrowing, which is great, but it's a monoculture of trees that can then be harvested again in 20 or 30 years. And you don't have the diversity of other plants. You don't have the same habitat. You don't have all of the benefits that come from having a natural biodiverse forest. So certainly some challenges that go along with um, our forest management and policies and practices of the last 100 years, that started with the creation of the Forest Service and the idea of fighting every fire, um, wherever it was, and not allowing fires to burn naturally. What's that has actually resulted in is an enormous buildup of fuels in our forests. So now when fires happen, they burn much hotter, they're much more intense, they're much more damaging, because fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. And so in a healthy natural forest, there would be sort of regular intervals of fires that would come through, but because those fires happened fairly regularly, that would clear out a lot of the underbrush, it would clear out a lot of the deadwood, before it built up to dangerous levels. And trees have actually evolved to withstand those kind of low intensity small fires that would burn through. But because we fought those fires, now the fuel buildup is much greater, and the fires that happen are much more damaging. So again, that's where we see human intervention actually creating more problems than we're actually solving. So overharvesting is also an enormous issue in terms of biodiversity. So particularly within our ocean environments, we are taking out way more fish than can be sustained, and so the most essential species of fish that we depend on for food have crashed by about 50% over the last 40 years or so. So some of those real common fish that we used to eat a lot of are now really threatened and becoming a greater issue that we need to deal with. And that goes back to what we talked about last time in terms of the global commons and the challenge of managing an ocean resource that is global. There's no single entity that can control fishing and stop over harvesting, right? We have the law of the sea treaty, we have different economic zones that countries control, but it's very difficult to manage these resources. And we also have species that are endangered, and trade in those species. Things like ivory, of course, that we all know about, has pushed elephants and rhinos to the brink of extinction. Particularly, I think white rhinos may be extinct now, or black rhinos, one of them, is now extinct in the wild because of ivory trade, right? Other animals, tigers, those kinds of things are also very much threatened because they're a valuable trade commodity. And so that certainly is pushing over harvesting or over hunting of particular species as well. So invasive species are another way that we are impacting biodiversity and habitats. So zebra mussels are an enormous issue. You can see here the infestations are pretty significant across the Great Lakes and here in Wisconsin, in our lovely town, our lovely state, right, all along the Mississippi River here, coming up into other rivers. The Great Lakes are certainly covered up in zebra mussels, quagga mussels, other species that have been brought in largely on like ship ballast water. So ships will suck up a bunch of water to help balance their load. They'll travel across the globe and then dump that water out when they get into port, and all the species and whatever's been sucked up in that water end up in that new waterway and start to take over. So kudzu vine down in the southeast, which if anybody's been through parts of like Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, areas like that, kudzu vine was initially introduced as a ornamental plant. Also, because it grows very quickly, it was used in some highway projects to actually stabilize, the embankments and stuff as they were cutting through new highways. And it's just gone ape shit and taken over thousands and thousands of acres because it literally grows like a weed and just takes over everything. So if you want to Google kudzu vine infestation, you can see just how out of control that stuff can get. So significant challenges with these invasive species. And climate change is creating its own issues as well. So we're seeing ocean acidification. We talked a little bit about that last time. Movement of species. We're actually seeing as temperatures change, we're seeing species migrate further in our hemisphere. They're moving farther north, right? So we're seeing species that had been sort of more acclimated to warm weather are able to survive farther and farther north. We're seeing more cold dependent species having to migrate farther and farther north. As winters are shorter and warmer across the United States and other countries. So you can see on the graph here, you can actually see, some species that were starting to migrate pretty far. I mean, 400 miles for wild turkeys, 433 miles for the purple finch. So we're seeing pretty significant migrations of species being able to winter and spend time farther north. You can see average temperatures in the U.S., their change over time. Spike back in the 60s. The 70s, we talked about how there were fears in the 70s of a global ice age occurring, but then you can start to see a fairly, consistent climb since the 80s. So, talked about how shorter, warmer winters are contributing to forest fires, pests, and so forth. So, what do we do about this? How do we manage biodiversity and ensure that we have, we maintain biodiversity, we maintain species, we do all of these positive things that we need to do. One of the ways is through preservation of habitat, whether that be through national parks, natural preserves, other forms of protected landscapes, but we need to operate at a fairly significant scale. As you can imagine, ecosystems don't follow political boundaries. So you can't just put, a park in one area and say this is protected and we've protected everything. Because what ends up happening is you lose corridors of migration, you lose connectivity between habitats and ecosystems that allow for individuals of species to move together to maintain genetic diversity. You lose the benefits of having a large enough area protected to ensure biodiversity. So parks and open space are necessary to maintain ecosystems and biodiversity, but they have to be at a large enough scale to ensure you're maintaining adequate diversity. So we have offsite preservations, things like zoos, botanical gardens. Those are super important in preserving species. So we see now zoos are a major player in protecting endangered species because they have individuals that are protected, kept safe, they're not hunted, they're not poached. And that being able to breed those different individuals across different zoos allows the maintenance of biodiversity, because what happens when populations get too small, they start to lose genetic diversity through inbreeding, and that weakens the population and can contribute to them dying out, them becoming more vulnerable to diseases and other issues, and going extinct. So maintaining biodiversity is an important role that zoos do play. Botanical gardens are the same thing for plants, right? They're maintaining species diversity. They're maintaining, discrete populations of different species that can then be connected, interbred to maintain genetic diversity. And the seed doomsday vaults, there's a couple of them around the globe, and they are actually used to store particular seeds. So in the event of a global catastrophe, nuclear war, massive, climate change, whatever it might be, we have a storehouse of seeds to rebuild agriculture, and plant diversity. So they're saving original unmodified seeds, um, in these doomsday vaults, so that in the event again of a catastrophe, we can access those and use them. Because many seeds today, the proprietary seeds that our industrial agriculture is dependent on, are designed not to sort of naturally reproduce in many cases, because the companies that produce the seeds want the farmers to buy new seeds every year. So you can't, we talked about saving seeds back to plant for the next year. The way seeds are modified now, many of them don't allow for that. So you have to buy new seeds every year. These seeds that are being protected in these doomsday vaults are the ones that you can propagate naturally and recreate agriculture in the event of bad things happening. And that's all I've got for today. So have a great afternoon or morning or whenever you're actually watching this. I will talk to y'all next time.